you going? Today we are tackling the conversation around homework. Do our kids actually need it, and is it really doing them any favours? Well, some of us feel we have to do it to give our kids the best head start in life. A lot of us feel that it's just all too much, and the stress just simply isn't worth it. So today we're going to be talking to a fabulous teacher who's based down in Adelaide, and she's not afraid to speak up when it comes to ditching homework and replacing it with more time to relax, connect, move and play. Clare Crew is an early childhood and inclusive education teacher who specialises in the brain-body connection. She helps the children the system leaves behind, those with learning, attention, developmental and behavioural challenges. Her message is simple. Children need more movement and more play in the early years of life. And when we're able to deliver this, children begin to thrive. Welcome, Clare.
Hi, Rhiannon. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on and finally get to chat about all things homework and play and movement and all the things that you are passionate about.
It is such an important topic, I think, for all children, but especially those who have additional needs.
Absolutely. Well, let's kickstart today by talking a little bit about your journey. So I'd love to rewind and start with a bit about your background and your journey to becoming really involved and looking at the whole child.
So I'm an early childhood educator and I have been for 14 years. It's something that I had my eyes set on from a pretty young age, really, wanting to work in childcare or kindies or schools. And I've always loved the role, but I think sometimes when you're in that position, you're really getting a close look at how well it's meeting the needs of some children, what you're doing, what, I guess mainstream is offering, and how poorly it's meeting the needs of other children. And so that's certainly, in those first few years of teaching when I got a particular interest in the area of inclusive education and realised that I wanted to learn a whole lot more than what I had in my first degree. But I think that's also when the questioner in me was awoken a little bit as well. So I went on and got a master's degree of special education, and I was doing that part-time over many, many years while I was teaching at the same time, and then while I had young ones, children of my own as well. And so that gave me a lot more knowledge and skills in regards to catering to the whole child and every child, not just children who are sort of developmentally ready and keen for what we have on offer. And I think that's when I started to get a lot more into advocacy, really seeing that in order to support children who do have different needs, as parents of these children, we really need to step up and be advocates for them. But also as educators, we need to really be trying different things out and questioning if what we're doing is really meeting the needs of all children, and if not, what can we do to change it?
I love it. And I love that you are so passionate about it, because we really need passionate advocates like yourself to really be questioning, I suppose, what we're doing, at school, and if we're sort of heading in the right direction. And not only focusing just on the academic side, really looking at that holistic perspective of looking at a child's well-being. Because I think sometimes we do get caught so much in the academic side of things and whether our child's getting a good score on a test that everything else sort of fades away sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And that's not the way it should be, because first and foremost, we've got to feel safe. And for a lot of our children in the classroom, that's not a space that they feel safe and secure. And unless we actually look at them as a whole child and embrace them as a whole human being, we're really not going to advance the academics anyway. We've got to actually look at all the parts that make up them, support all of development, because there's a lot of developmental stages that need to come in place before we layer in the academics anyway. So if we just focus too much on formal learning, we are really leaving a lot of children at a disadvantage.
Yeah. Now, you talk about three main ingredients that kids need to thrive, and I absolutely 110% believe in these ingredients, and particularly for kids on the spectrum, I think they need this. Can we talk about each of those key areas?
Yeah, so movement is one that I talk about, and movement is something that often we just think of as the extra thing. You know, some children might be quite wriggly and need lots of movement. It might be something that children can do, you know, in an organised sport or recess and lunch, but actually movement is so much more important than that in the early years of life, but also if there's developmental challenges that remain. Movement is essential for brain development, really. It's movement and brain development are so interconnected. So if we value brain development in that academic way and all the other ways that shows up, we also need to value movement. So children have this drive to move because that is how they learn. Then we have play. So play is, again, often seen as the stuff that gets done when children have finished their homework or at the end of the learning day. It's not often valued, but play is something that humans and animals have sort of innately embedded in us. And it's how we develop the survival skills that we need for our life. So because, you know, humans obviously have lots of different skills and things that we need in life, that period of play, that duration of play in our lives is needed well beyond the first 5 years. Play isn't something that should stop the moment a child starts school and enters the classroom life. It's something that really needs to continue the whole way through. And then the third one that I talk about is connection, because to feel seen and to feel heard are qualities that we really need in our life, no matter what our age, but particularly for children. It is what tells them that they're okay. You know, they are liked, they are loved, they are appreciated. And this is especially key for children who don't necessarily fit in the box that we have prescribed for them. They need to feel that, you know, we've got their back no matter what. And even though they might challenge us and even though they might behave in ways that we're not necessarily always okay with, they've got a support team behind them for the rest of their lives.
I love that. I love those three: movement, play, and connection. So firstly with movement, I think I totally agree. It's very important, and it is something that sort of is used as a reinforcer or a reward. You know, after kids do their homework, then they can go out and jump on the trampoline. But often it's something that we need prior to that sit-down tabletop activity so that they are ready to learn. And that they, like you said, it is that brain development in the early stages of life. Obviously, that's how the brain starts making all its neural connections, is through movement patterns. And as they get older, it's something we tend to forget about, and it's not as important, but it really is.
Thank you for saying that so much more articulately than I did, Rhiannon. And also, you know, if that is a topic that interests people, heading back to your episode that you did with Angela Hanscom, that was just brilliant, and her book is amazing. And even just in that book, it's quite eye-opening because she breaks down how many hours children of different ages need to be active each day, and it is above and beyond what we're told as a government recommendation.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, that's right. It's, movement develops obviously gross motor skills, hand-eye coordination, but it also develops the skills I think that we don't tend to look at, which is like the social skills and turn-taking and sharing and all those other little skills that it's really important. And if they don't have that opportunity, I suppose, for outdoor meaningful play, then they don't get that opportunity for developing other skills that they need, other life skills.
And I think it's also just important for coping with those day-to-day stressors, because I know for me, for example, if I'm getting, you know, a bit overwhelmed by something, the best thing for me to do is to get outside and ideally, you know, go for a brisk walk. And for a lot of our children, you know, life can be quite overwhelming and quite stressful. And so to be able to actually physically, you know, work out some of those stressors, that that's really valuable as well.
Absolutely. And connection. So that was your third point. But yeah, connection, that is super important, I think, for kids on the spectrum, because often this is an area that they have a lot of difficulty with. So, it may be, they're not making the eye contact, so parents feel like they're not connecting with their child, or they may be nonverbal or not have really great communication skills. So really being able to join their world and getting on their level and becoming fascinated in whatever it is that they are fascinated in, and developing that connection with them is super important.
Yeah, and knowing that connection, as you just touched on, it might look different to how you thought connecting with your child would look. It might not necessarily be all of the touch and the affection and the cuddles if that's not what your child is wanting and is seeking. It might not look like the eye contact. You might not be having those words of affection shared very often, but there will be a way that you can connect in with your child. And so you kind of need to throw away the rule book and just be ready to do things in a way that suits you and your child.
Do you have any tips for that? Is there anything that you've found useful in terms of helping parents connect with their kids better?
I think firstly, it's the mindset of just letting go of how you thought things were meant to be. It's definitely a case of, focusing on the present and focusing on the positive, as opposed to just always getting bogged down in something that just happened that was a bit negative, or filling your mind with ideas and decisions about what's going to happen in their future. Really just being in the present with them, because they can feel that. Being ready to love them in whatever way, shape or form they present themselves. But also, if you're wanting more practical ideas, I've recently discovered the Marty Mayo approach, and I'm finding that so valuable. I wish that I had that in my toolkit when I was working in a special education setting. So that's definitely something that is worth looking into. It's really there's 4 basic principles, and it can get quite complex, but at a basic level, it's really easy to understand.
Just say what it was called again. Sorry, what was it called?
Marty Mayo.
Okay.
So yeah, it began in Holland with a lady called Maria Arts, and it evolved from her work with children with autism. But since then, it's become quite mainstream across many countries, many different areas of life. So it is used a lot by educators in mainstream and special ed, but it's also used for working with elderly patients, for example, who have dementia. It's been dubbed the how-to of attachment. So it's things like, following your child's lead, having a good face, having a good tone in your voice, verbalizing what you see your child doing, and also attaching the emotions that you're feeling or that they're feeling wrapped in with that. And I do have a 4-part short podcast series on it if people want to look into that. But there's also the website, which has heaps of information. I think it's martymayo.com.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. I haven't come across that.
No, neither had I. And it feels so warm and fuzzy, and it really, really works.
Okay, excellent. Alrighty, let's move on to homework. So homework, obviously, for some families can be an absolute battlefield. It can cause major meltdowns. Kids can become super defiant. And parents just feel like they're constantly nagging their kids, at the end of a hard day of school to, quickly pack away their school bag and everything like that, and then sit down and do their homework before they can have their free play. So it becomes incredibly stressful, and parents are getting burnt out. So I suppose what I want to start by asking is homework something that kids really need in their life?
No, they don't. As you've just described, it's not positive for the whole family. Definitely not positive for the child, especially if it's a child who really all day long has worked additionally hard just to be able to sit still and to focus and to cope with the additional stimulation from a sensory point of view that's in the classroom, or perhaps rules that they can't quite understand, all that kind of stuff. Homework isn't ideal for any children. It's taking too much time away from those positive three things that we just spoke about: movement, play, and connection. But also the research doesn't actually show that there are benefits of homework, particularly in the primary years of school. So the small benefits that they've kind of linked in with homework, it's still a little questionable, but they start at about years 10, 11 and 12, so that upper secondary level.
Wow.
So you've got to go, too much stress. It's removing those opportunities for my child to move, play, and have that quality time with me. And it also is really dubious, these positive benefits that I'm being told that it actually has.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you mentioned about the research that it's not really supporting kids in the younger years, particularly primary. What's it saying? Is it saying that we shouldn't be doing any homework at all, or does it give an amount of time, maybe, per week that we should be doing homework, or just cut it all together?
I guess I'm seeing it through the lens of let's just cut it all together. But maybe if I share a few components of the research and then people can make up their own mind about it. The homework research, it really taps into 4 different areas. And the first is academic performance. And in a study back in 1998, so quite some time ago now, Cooper found out that there's no significant relationship between the amount of homework a student completes and their performance on tests and assessment tasks. And then a bit more recently, Horsley and Walker, they pretty much reviewed all of the existing research around homework and student performance and found that there weren't any gains in junior primary or even in upper primary in most cases. And then in the middle years, I guess we're talking lower secondary, there was only like a very sort of mild hint that there's a connection there between the relationship with homework and academic performance. And then there's a bit more of a significant connection there with homework and school performance at that senior high school level. But I also think that by senior high school level, children are more able to cope then, and they've got more of an investment in that. That homework is more likely to be connected to assignments and actually getting their high school certificate. So to me, that makes much more sense than, expecting a 5-year-old to come home after a long, tiring day of school and doing more there. There is a very small group academically who do benefit from homework that I do need to touch on, and they are the children who are already ahead academically and who love homework. So they are the only children that seem to come out on top, who seem to actually benefit from homework. So they're the ones who are already ahead academically and who are those who enjoy it. So they're the ones who are likely to want to do the homework anyway, even if you say that they don't have to. But it's really important to note that it's not helpful for children who are behind academically, because I think sometimes there's this idea that if a child is ahead, then they don't need the homework. But if a child is behind, it's the homework that's really going to make the difference to help them catch up to their peers. And in actual fact, I think that they're the children who homework is the most damaging for.
That's so interesting, because I would have sort of come from that perspective thinking, if they are behind, as a parent myself, I'd want to spend the time after school trying to catch them up on the things that they're not doing so well in class.
Yeah, and I think that's when we have to bring it back to the start of the conversation in talking about the whole child. So, sitting down and slugging over homework together, they're usually fried, especially children on the spectrum. They've worked so hard all day long, and it might not look it, but they really are. There's a lot going on underneath the surface. And when they get home, I really feel like they need to decompress. They need to tap in for the first time that day probably with what they feel they need to do to feel good in their skin and feel good about themselves. So it might just be, laying on a beanbag and just really being a vegetable for a while, or it might be running outside in the sun and, in nature. It might be that they want to have, some cuddles and read a book together. It might be that they want to play a board game. There's so many ways that it can show up, and it's probably going to look different on every different day of the week. But I think that is actually going to help the learning more than slugging away with homework, because it's that recharge, it's that reboot. And I think in regards to children's mental health, it's really valuable too, because then they see, if they don't like school, then they see that actually I've still got something good in my life each day, and they have that freedom to discover other things that aren't within that learning day that they are good at, that they do have that passion for. It's not, I think it's dangerous to send a message to children that it's all about academics, because ultimately, once you have finished school, you kind of got to play the game until you're an adult. But then once you do leave school, there are so many ways to be successful. And it's not necessarily going to university. It's not necessarily following an academic path. And as parents, I think we have a big role there in understanding that for ourselves, because I think too many of us are hung up on the fact that a successful life does look like going to uni and getting a degree and getting a high income, as opposed to going, do you know what? It might look different for my child, and that's okay. We need so many different roles and personalities and qualities in our society to make it work. And as we're finding out now, so many people are going to university and getting a degree, and there's just not enough work there for them. So if your child chooses to and is driven to have that life, that's absolutely fine. But I think we need to also help them get to know themselves in these other less academic ways too.
Wow, that was so empowering. I loved that little snippet. Oh my God, I got goosebumps. It's so true. It's so true. I loved it how you said, if they're struggling at school and they're having a hard day and they're just dragging their feet around, and then they come home and they've got to do more of that stuff that they're not good at and that they're struggling with, what sort of, how good is their life, quality of life. But if they came home and, it was that safe place where they could go and be themselves, and that just, really resonated with me. I think that's a really important message, that we make home a place where we can build on their strengths and show them ways in which, they can contribute and have a meaningful, positive experience.
Absolutely. And that's one of the other areas that the research around homework actually taps into. So some of the studies actually look specifically at student wellbeing, and probably the most significant one is from Kuzma and Kennedy in 2002, and they found that there was a direct correlation found between how much time high school students spend on homework and their feelings of anger, depression, and anxiety. And so while some people listening might say, well, my child's actually at primary school, I still think, the studies particularly focused on high school students, but I think the same can be true for children at that lower level of school, especially if they have a high volume of homework, or especially if the homework is just not speaking to them. It's not engaging them. It's too hard. It's too boring. It's just not what they want to be doing. And certainly another area that the research looks at is that parent involvement. And, while you were saying that the thought of, supporting our child who might be behind with homework, that should, we often think of that as being a helpful thing. The research again really says that while parent involvement at school is valuable, whether that's going along to meetings, going along to assemblies, wanting to look at their schoolwork at home sometimes if you're someone who can't actually get into school very often because of work commitments or family commitments, homework is not a positive way to get involved in our children's learning lives. It has a high emotional cost, such as increased pressure, and tension in that parent-child relationship. So often it's interesting because often schools will say that homework is that bridge between school and home, and that this is a way that you can get involved in your child's education. But the research is actually saying, yes, your child needs to feel like you're involved in their education, but homework is not the way.
Okay, so I've got a good question for you.
Yes.
If the research is saying that we shouldn't be doing homework or that it's not beneficial for academic performance, why on earth are we have got all these high expectations on our kids to do lots of homework? Because I know my daughter started transition or grade prep this year, and first week she already had homework, and it's simple stuff, but for kids on their first week of first year of school, it can be obviously overwhelming for some kids who are just getting into the routine of going to school. But why is it then, if the studies aren't supporting it, why are we expecting kids to do homework?
I actually have no idea, Rhiannon, and this is one of the things that really frustrates me, because some of that research, some of the research is quite new, it's only a few years old, but some of it goes back to the 90s. So I don't really feel like this is new information. It's been out there a long time. Sometimes it takes a long time in different industries for the research to actually trickle through into what's seen as best practice. So I think that's definitely the case for schools sometimes. And yet, the STEM stuff and inquiry-based practice and all these other things have trickled through very quickly. So I'm not quite sure. I think that there's a real emotional attachment to homework. For a lot of parents, as much as I'm saying say no to homework and you don't have to do it, there are parents who actually really like homework, even if their child doesn't like it. So they do feel that that's a way that they can get involved, or they do feel like, that discipline is a good thing for their child that sets them up for the workforce later. Or they do just have that sense that, well, I had to do homework when I was at school, so they have to do it too. And I think for a lot of educators, some of them are really just setting homework even though they don't believe in it, because it's a requirement that they support the policies of the school that they're employed by. And yet for other educators, sometimes they feel like homework is the only way that they can actually fit in everything within the curriculum. So they're really tapping into that after school time to make sure that they can tick off all their boxes, as opposed to having a more laid back approach. You can tick off all the boxes and say, well, I've covered all these things in the curriculum. But if you've got children who are zombies, they're just kind of empty vessels in the classroom, not able to take on anything else because we're not looking at them holistically, it's not knowledge that they're actually going to take with them into the following classroom the next year anyway.
Absolutely. So if parents are wanting to adopt this sort of no homework approach, how do they go about it? Because I know you've said before that, because I've listened, you've got some podcasts on this as well, on this topic, so on the homework, and you did say that every school has they don't have a no homework policy. They have a homework policy. So how do parents get around it and approach this if there's a policy in place around doing homework?
Yeah, almost every school will have a homework policy, even if it's called something else, like a home learning policy. It is still a homework policy. So the first thing that parents can do is actually access that policy and read it, because I think that is really key in informing your approach. It kind of lets you know how hardcore they are with homework. And for most public schools, they will have the homework policy on their website. Some private schools do, not so many, but either way, if you can't find yours online, just going to the front office, or if you're not at school physically very often, just, phone them and ask for it to be sent home with your child. And you don't have to get into a discussion at that point. You're just saying, I'd like a copy of the school's homework policy, please. And anyone who is involved in a school has the right to access any of the policies that are there. So that's pretty easy. I know, for example, that some policies, because in that podcast series you mentioned, I did examine a few different homework policies, and some will actually specify that, homework is there as an option, but it's not mandatory. And that way, that if your teacher at that school is saying it's mandatory, you can sort of point towards the policy to say, actually, at a school-based level, this isn't something that we have to participate in. Other schools might have a pretty firm policy that will actually specify the consequences for children if that homework isn't done. And sadly, quite often that consequence is actually missing out on lunch play or some kind of playtime, which I'm completely not okay with at all. So I think the first step is just getting to know what the policy is, and then from there, the negotiations can begin.
And how do you see that play out? Because I know you have had the conversation with some of your daughter's teachers. How does that conversation go down?
It's interesting. Every year you don't quite know how it's going to go down. I've actually got 3 children. So my eldest is in year 5 this year. Then my son, who's in the middle, he's 9, so he's in year 4. And then my youngest is in year 1. So we've been doing this for quite a few years now, sort of from reception for my eldest onwards. I thought it would get more challenging in middle primary, but actually some of the middle primary teachers have been more open to this than the junior primary teachers. Quite often, particularly if you've got a child who's just starting school, most teachers are really okay with you just saying, look, they're really exhausted when they get home. This just really isn't for us. With my son in particular, in his first year of school, he had sensory processing disorder at the time, which is something that he doesn't actually have going on anymore as a result of, the way we eat and the movement therapies and things like that we've done to treat it holistically. But for him back then, he was able to function really well in the classroom during the day, which amazed me. But when he came home, it was just meltdown city. And so that was a really easy conversation to have, just to say, look, like, he's beyond it. He's really demanding of us that we just have nurturing afternoons. He needs to move, he needs to play, he needs to snuggle. He just needs to have some freedom. Then some of the other conversations we've had have been more challenging. So yeah, a lot of teachers have been fine with it. Some have really questioned us a lot, and we've had more formal meetings with the leadership team as well. But we're at a position at our current school now. This is the second school that we've been at where they know our stance and we don't really have to renegotiate each year. They know that we're not going to be doing it, and they're not imposing consequences for my children for not doing it. I think the best way to approach it is really just to initially word it from the teacher's point of view almost. You don't want this to seem like an attack on the teacher or that you're not going to work in collaboration with them. So there's a really fine balancing act there. So I often sort of say, thank you for setting the homework. I know that, you're wanting my child to succeed to their full potential this year. However, I really feel that developmentally there's other things that I need to be doing after school to support my child. And particularly, if you do have a child with autism, you might be having additional appointments and things after school anyway, or you might just really want that time to go slow. So really sort of spelling out what you will be doing in the afternoons instead, and, letting them know that this is really in line with what the research has to say as well. So I'm not concerned that my child is going to be any worse off for it. I actually think this is going to support them developmentally.
Absolutely. And I think what you said there will resonate with so many of the mums, that, kids will keep it together when they're at school and when they get home, and as soon as they're in the car, that meltdown can begin. It's just any little thing will tip them over the edge and it's all too much, and they're in their safe space, so they will just completely fall apart.
Absolutely. And I almost think that's harder in a way, Rhiannon, because I think the educator doesn't have the same clues that that child isn't coping as when the behaviour and the meltdowns are at school. So on the surface, it looks like, wow, this child has that label and they might struggle in these ways, but actually they're doing really well in the classroom. And so then they're not seeing that there will be an issue with things like homework. It actually, that mask the child is wearing is pretty firmly in place, but then at home with the unconditional love, it kind of comes off. So that's where that communication with the child's educators is so important, because they see one version of your child and you see the other version. And so they need to be aware that that other version exists, because sometimes if there's a triggering situation at school, they won't notice the fallout. You do. So you're the person who's got the best tabs on how classroom life is for them, really.
Yeah, so important. So important. Okay, so I might shift gears a little bit and talk about what kids should be doing instead of homework. So I'd love to hear from you what you do with your kids after school. What does it look like?
Yeah, I guess we've been doing this so long now that it's really just like life is on the weekends or in school holidays, in that there's just freedom.
I'm sure kids would love to hear that.
There's just freedom. I'm there and I'm available, but I'm not necessarily holding their hand and doing everything with them. So board games are quite often a feature of our after school periods. Being outside definitely is. Sometimes my two younger ones tend to just naturally be outside moving lots. My oldest is a bit of a bookworm, so she needs a bit of encouragement. But I find even if we just have our after school snack outside, or I do a bit of gardening outside, that kind of, lures them out, because I really do value that movement and that play and that nature time. Often it's a lot of reading. So we've never even done the readers, and a lot of people get concerned that then a child won't learn how to read. But actually what it has meant for us is that my children can read. They can read well and they love to read, because the focus was always in those early years of school on me reading to them and us enjoying stories together. And we continue to do that, but now they also have the skills to be reading novels themselves as well. One afternoon a week, we have a couple of friends that come over. They just walk home from school with us, and then their parents pick them up after they're done with the day of work. So sometimes we have friends and things. We are pretty low key when it comes to extracurricular activities. There's only 2 of those that happen sort of at the end of the week or the weekend. I really just want the after school periods to be empty and full of whatever my children want to fill them with. So there's really no have-tos at all. It is just them choosing what to do. And yes, this has looked different, I guess, at different stages of life. When my 10-year-old was 5 and I had, a baby, and I had a very demanding 3 and 4-year-old as well, I needed to be a lot more involved. And I definitely know that some of you listening in can't necessarily just let your kids go and do whatever without supervision. Certainly we've spent quite a bit of time building up to that point. I think a key thing that I want to highlight is that it's not screen time. So my children have screens on weekends, in that they'll watch a movie on the weekend days, but they don't have access to iPads. And during the week, it's technology free, because I guess knowing what I know about brain development and how addictive a lot of those games and educational apps, I'm using my little quotation marks there, are.
I heard it.
I know that there are way better things for them to be doing with their time, and they're not asking for it because it's just not part of their life. And so I think sometimes teachers fear that no homework is just going to lead to more screen time. And I guess that's a slight concern I have for some families as well. And so I think that if you are adopting a no homework approach, you really need to bring in some firm boundaries around the screens as well, knowing that you are the adult and you get to make the decisions about how that's going to fly. And it can be very traumatic at the start because a lot of our kids are addicted to these devices. A lot of us are addicted to these devices, but you've just got to stay with it for a few weeks, and then your children will just naturally have more of a restored play drive. They're going to be more creative in how they spend their time. They're going to be more imaginative. And a key part of that too is that you need to detach from your own devices and be spending that time connecting with your child if that's what they're seeking.
Yes, so important. When the girls were younger, actually, Tyler, started loving certain TV programs and that, and I had to. Our power actually went out for like 4 days, so we couldn't actually watch the TV for 4 days. And it was a great transition into really reducing the amount of screen time because I just said, oh, no, the power's gone out. And for me, that was a great way. But, it can be trickier when there are older kids and they are completely addicted and just consumed. It is all consuming. And I suppose the thing that concerns me about the screen time is that you're only using 2 senses, really, aren't you? You're using your sight and you're using your hearing. Mm-hmm. You're not using any of your other senses. The kids sort of go a bit brain dead. So I totally agree with that point too, but it is difficult. But it's just small steps every day, reducing the amount of time slowly. And then, it could take a few months. It doesn't have to happen straight away, but if you know your sort of goal and what you're working towards, it can make it easier if you do small steps every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you talked about screens only using 2 senses, but even in regards to vision, it's completely different looking at a flat 2-dimensional screen than it is engaging with the 3-dimensional world. So there's a lot more children who are struggling with short-sightedness these days than there used to be. And I think that that's one of the contributing factors. Probably also the fact that less children are crawling and getting that tummy time and things in infancy as well. And, some people don't actually want to reduce the screen time. That just feels a bit too hard, and that's okay. Different things work for different families, but I definitely think that time that has previously been spent doing homework needs to be something different as opposed to additional screen time. So that could just be that you sit on the couch and you read together, or it might be that you do a board game. So create a new ritual to replace what used to be the homework.
Yeah, totally. Okay, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about before we head on over to the 5 rapid fire questions? I think we've sort of covered it all. But was there anything?
Yeah, I think we have covered it all. I think probably the only other thing to say in regards to screen time or homework in general, the best thing you can do in order to feel confident in making a different decision is to read or listen or learn. You need to go into these conversations with your family or with school feeling confident in this new decision that you've made.
Yeah. Empower yourself. And I think knowledge is power. And when you can use it, it can be a great vehicle to get to where you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets easier with time as well. Like I used to be a really rubbish advocate for my own children, but there've been enough experiences now that I feel like I'm getting fiercer each year. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty, cool. Well, let's head over to the 5 rapid fire questions. So number 1, what is one habit that parents can implement today?
Say no to homework.
Yeah, love it. All right. Every kid will love you, Claire. I'm sure they do. Number 2, what do people never ask you that you wish they did?
That's a good one. And I think I really feel like I get asked questions often, but I'm getting asked questions by eager parents and eager teachers. And I would love to be getting the questions from the politicians or from the education departments. It's who I want to have that information, those people higher up who perhaps are better able to make changes at a system level.
Yeah, that's right, because it's really happening at a grassroots level that the parents are saying we're not coping and they're starting to make the change. But yeah, that's great. Number 3, what book would you recommend all parents read?
I read a book a couple of years ago, called My Son's Not Rain Man by John Williams. And it is a dad's story of his son's development with autism. So, the diagnosis and daily life. And he's actually an English comedian as well. So there were parts of the book where I was in tears and parts of the book where I was laughing out loud. And it's just a really human and engaging read. He's also got it on Audible that he's read himself. If you're more of a listener, which you might be, seeing as you're listening to this podcast, it was such a good read. I do have family members in my life with autism, but not any of my own children. And I think it just gave me a whole new layer of empathy for what daily life is like for you guys.
I haven't read that, so it's on my list. I swear every podcast I do, it's a new book, and it's a new book that I have to add to my list.
I know. And then finding the time to actually read them is really hard. So maybe you might just want to listen into that one. It's so good. So good.
Okay, awesome. I will. Number 4, what is one of your unfinished bucket list items?
Publishing a book, which is happening very, very soon. So that's a good thing. Yay! I think I've just been putting it off. I wrote it's been written for a while. It's just kind of the final edit and actually getting it all designed, but it's coming. It's a book about tummy time for babies.
Excellent. Does it have a title yet?
Tummy Time Tactics.
Excellent. Okay, we'll keep our eyes peeled. And last question, number 5, if you could only offer one piece of advice to parents, what would it be?
Love your children as they are. Love them unconditionally, because if they just absorb your love, I think that they can go really, really far in their lifetime.
Beautiful. Lovely way to finish the show. And if people wanted to find out more about you, can you tell us what the website is, if you've got any Facebook or social media, and your podcast as well?
Yeah, so Thriving Children is my business name. So thrivingchildren.com.au is where you can find my website. And from there, there's links to social media and my podcast as well. But if you're just looking in iTunes at the moment, it's called the Thriving Children Podcast.
Excellent. And there are lots of great podcasts on your show. It's fantastic. You've interviewed some people, you do some on your own, and they're shorter, aren't they? They're about 20 to 30 minutes usually.
Yeah, so usually about 30. Yeah. And there's stuff on homework and stuff on Marty, Mayo, and I'll need to get you on soon to do a bit of a theme on autism as well, Rhiannon.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love that. So if you did want to delve into a little bit more homework, definitely check out the Thriving Children podcast, because there's a few episodes on that. So thank you so much, Claire. I love your thinking around the whole child approach, and I love your passion. I love that you're okay with stepping outside the box and going against the grain a little bit compared to what other teachers are doing, or what, the system is telling them to do in terms of homework approach. And I think you definitely will have won over many parents around the country after this chat. So, thank you so much. It's been a really wonderful conversation.
You're welcome, Rhiannon. It's been awesome speaking to you as well.
Alrighty, cheers. Thanks, Claire. Talk to you later.
Bye.